The city never fully slept. But at 2 o'clock in the morning in February, with a blizzard pressing down on every street and corner, it came close. The streets were empty. The traffic lights changed for no one. The buildings stood dark against the white sky, waiting for dawn that wouldn't come for hours. Darius Webb had learned to love these hours. The silence. The predictability. The way the world asked nothing of him except to drive home without incident. He'd been driving these streets for 14 years. 14 years of night shifts and early mornings and the particular exhaustion that comes from being the person who keeps things running while everyone else slept. He was 40 minutes from his apartment when he saw the hazard lights. A black sedan parked half on the curb along the edge of Crestwood Park. The kind of car that cost more than he made in 2 years. Maybe more than he made in 3 years. The engine was dead. The hazard lights blinked in slow, weakening pulses, like something running out of time, like a heartbeat that was getting fainter, getting slower, about to stop. He pulled over without thinking about it. That was the kind of man Darius Webb was. Not reckless, not heroic, not the type to insert himself into situations that weren't his responsibility, just incapable of driving past something wrong. It was a flaw maybe, or a strength. He'd never figured out which one. She was standing beside the car in a wool coat that was not built for this temperature. No hat, no gloves. She had been out here long enough for the cold to settle into her posture, long enough for her shoulders to hunch slightly inward, long enough for the wind to make her lean just a little bit sideways. But her face was composed in a way that made him feel like he was the one intruding, like he was the one who didn't belong here. He reached for his phone to call for help. She crossed the distance between them in 3 steps. Quick steps, determined steps, and placed her hand on his arm, not gently, not asking, just placing her hand there and holding firm. "Don't call anyone." Her voice was low and precise, the kind of voice that belonged to someone used to being obeyed. "And don't tell anyone you saw me." Not a plea, not panic. The quiet instruction of someone who had already made the decision and was simply waiting for him to catch up. "I need to call someone," Darius said. "Your car." "I know about my car. I left it here deliberately. Are you going to help me or are you going to ask questions?" Something in her tone made him stop. Something in the way she was looking at him made him understand that this woman was used to people doing what she asked, no matter how strange the request. "What do you need?" he asked. "A ride. Away from here. Somewhere that isn't on a highway, isn't a main road, isn't anywhere a person would expect me to go. How far, I don't know yet. He'll tell you when we get there." Darius drove her to a 24-hour diner 2 miles east and said very little. The drive took 8 minutes. She didn't speak. She stared out the window at the dark landscape sliding past, at the empty streets and the closed businesses and the occasional streetlight cutting through the snow. Her hands were clenched in her lap. Her jaw was tight. Whatever this was, it mattered to her. Whatever this was, it scared her. But she was too controlled to show fear. She was too practiced at hiding to let it show in her face. The diner was the kind of place that existed in the margins of the night. Fluorescent lights buzzing slightly too loud. A waitress who'd been on shift too long. A handful of other people occupying booths and stools. Nobody paying attention to anything except their own exhaustion and their own coffee cups. It wasn't until his phone lit up with the financial news alert, one he had set months ago because her company had a contract tied to the city grid. He maintained that he saw her face on the screen and understood what he had walked into. Claire Harmon, CEO, Harmon Capital, $400 million merger. Signing expected within 48 hours. The headline read, "Harmon Capital CEO Claire Harmon poised to sign transformative merger with Stratton Group." He looked at the woman across the table, both hands wrapped around a coffee cup she hadn't touched. She already knew he recognized her. She didn't look away. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She just met his eyes and waited for him to decide what he was going to do with this information. If this kind of story gets under your skin, the kind where an ordinary person gets pulled into something much bigger than themselves and has to decide what kind of man they really are, you're going to want to stick around. Because these are the stories that matter. These are the moments that change everything. Hit follow so you don't miss what comes next. Darius Webb was 38 years old and had not done anything impulsive in nearly a decade. His life was built on caution, built on routine, built on the kind of predictability that allowed a single father to maintain control over the uncontrollable. He worked the night shift for the city's Department of Electrical Infrastructure, maintenance and fault detection along the urban grid, the kind of work that kept the lights on in other people's lives while he drove home in the dark, while he made sure that when people in their warm houses flipped a switch, the lights came on. When they plugged in their coffee makers, when they powered their heaters against the winter cold. Those lights came on because people like him fixed systems they'd never see, fixed problems they'd never know existed, kept things running so invisible that nobody thought about them until they stopped working. The job was stable, the hours were punishing. He worked nights because nights paid slightly more, because the overtime added up, because every dollar mattered when you were raising a child alone. The pay was enough, as long as enough didn't require too precise a definition. He had a daughter named Nora, 7 years old, almost 8. She slept with one arm hanging off the bed, the other tucked under a pillow. She woke up ready to argue about everything. About breakfast, about the color of her shirt, about whether her socks matched in a way that mattered. She was a particular child, a challenging child, a child who needed more than most children did. Raising her alone had not been the plan. Plans, he had learned, was something you made before you understood what life actually cost. Before you understood that life was expensive in ways that had nothing to do with money, that it was expensive in time, in attention, in the constant vigilance required to make sure your child didn't slip through cracks that were wider than you ever imagined. His ex-wife Shanice had left 3 years ago, not cruelly, not dramatically, not in the way that shows up in television shows or movies, just quietly, with an honesty that almost made it worse. They'd been sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening. Nora was already asleep. The dishes were done. The evening stretched ahead of them like it stretched ahead of them every other night. And Shanice had said, "I can't do this version of things anymore." He hadn't asked her to explain which version she meant. He'd known. He'd watched her struggle. He'd watched her try to be a mother and a wife and a person with her own dreams. And he'd watched those dreams get smaller every year, until they disappeared entirely. He understood. He didn't like it. But he understood. She sent money sometimes, not regularly, not enough to matter in a monthly budget, but enough that Darius knew she thought about Nora, that she hadn't completely abandoned the idea of being a mother. She'd just abandoned the day-to-day reality of it, the early mornings, the homework help, the constant vigilance. Every night when he came home from work, he checked on Nora before turning off any lights. He would open her bedroom door, look at her sleeping, make sure she was still breathing, make sure nothing had happened while he was gone. That was the whole of his ritual. That was enough. It had to be enough. Because the alternative was terrifying. The alternative was considering what would happen if something went wrong. If she needed him and he wasn't there. If she woke up scared and there was no one to comfort her, if something broke and he couldn't fix it. He had applied once to an advanced electrical engineering program through the city, a 2-year track that could have moved him from maintenance into design, from fixing existing systems to building new ones. It would have meant more money. It would have meant better hours. It would have meant a future where he wasn't just keeping things running, where he was creating something. Designing something, building infrastructure that would last decades. He withdrew his application 4 days before the deadline. There was no one to pick Nora up from school on the days his shift ran long. Mrs. Patterson did after-school care, but she charged $12 an hour and Darius couldn't afford to extend those hours indefinitely. If he was in a program studying late into the evening, there would be days when Nora had nowhere to go. When she was waiting, when she was scared because her father was late, he told himself he'd apply again next cycle. He had not. And now 3 years had passed, and the program had moved on, and other people were designing electrical systems, and Darius was still maintaining them, still fixing what was broken, still keeping the lights on for other people's lives. He was in the way of many men who had quietly absorbed too many losses, extremely good at convincing himself he was fine, that this life was enough, that he didn't need more than this, that his sacrifice meant something because he'd made it for his daughter. Claire Harmon was 41 and had not felt fine in longer than she could accurately measure. She ran Harmon Capital, the commercial real estate firm her father Gerald Harmon had built over 30 years, from a single property management office in Baltimore into one of the Mid-Atlantic's most recognized development groups. Gerald had been a visionary, a man who understood real estate not just as profit but as community. He developed properties in ways that honored the existing neighborhoods, that didn't displace residents, that created something beautiful and functional and humane. He'd made millions doing it, but he'd made those millions in a way that allowed him to sleep at night. Gerald had died 22 months ago. A heart attack, swift and unglamorous, the way he would have preferred. He'd been at a construction site reviewing details with a contractor when his heart simply stopped. He died doing what he loved, and he died before he could see what would happen to his company without him. He left Claire the company with one condition written into the trust structure. She was to retain controlling interest for a minimum of 5 years before any sale or merger could be finalized without unanimous board approval. Gerald had known his nephew Richard Harmon would try. He had not anticipated how efficiently Richard would work, how quickly he would move to dismantle his uncle's vision. The merger with Stratton Group was Richard's project from the beginning, a national commercial developer with aggressive urban expansion plans, the kind of company that looked at neighborhoods not as communities, but as opportunities, as property to be bought and sold and reshaped for maximum profit. The deal was structured to look like growth, like opportunity, like Harmon Capital was being elevated to something bigger and better. What it was in practice was a rezoning play. 3 residential neighborhoods in the city's lower income corridor would be reclassified as mixed commercial zones within 18 months of closing. The Crestwood neighborhood where Darius had grown up. The East Side community where his grandmother had lived for 40 years. The North District where families had roots going back generations. The residents who had lived there for decades would have no legal protection once the classification changed. Once the neighborhoods became commercial zones, they could be developed. The buildings could be torn down. The residents could be evicted. The entire character of those neighborhoods could be erased. And it would all be legal. It would all be perfectly, ruthlessly legal. The numbers worked beautifully on paper. Harmon Capital would make hundreds of millions of dollars. Stratton Group would expand its footprint. Richard would position himself as the engineer of a major corporate success. The city would collect development fees. Everybody would get rich, except for the 200 families who would lose their homes, except for the old people who would lose the neighborhoods they'd lived in their entire lives, except for the communities that would be dismantled for profit. Gerald Harmon had reviewed an early version of the proposal 8 months before he died. He'd spent 3 hours reading it, reading the fine print, understanding exactly what was being proposed, and had refused to proceed. He'd written a note on the proposal, just 1 sentence, written in his own hand, marked with his signature. Claire had found his handwritten note in a folder she wasn't supposed to have access to. A folder in his private office, behind a false wall in his desk, like he'd known that someday someone would need to find it. This is not what we built this for. 5 words, 18 letters, but enough to tell her everything she needed to know about her father's moral compass, and about the fact that Richard was proposing to destroy everything Gerald had spent 30 years building. She was the only person who had seen it. The board had scheduled the signing for Friday morning. The ceremony would be at 10 a.m. at the law offices of Harmon Capital. Photographers would be there. News outlets would cover it. And by Friday afternoon, it would be official. It was now Wednesday, just past 2 a.m., and Claire had left her hotel room without her security detail. She had driven herself into a storm she had underestimated. The weather forecast had said clear skies through the week. But the storm had come anyway, the way storms sometimes did, unexpected and overwhelming. And she had ended up on the side of a road in Crestwood watching her hazard lights fade. She had not planned to let a stranger help her. She had made a plan to run away, to disappear for 48 hours, to think without someone in her ear, to make a decision without the pressure of the board or Richard or her own fear of consequences. She had not planned most of the things that were currently true about her life. At the diner, they sat in a corner booth under fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly worse than it was. The lights made the coffee look dingy, made the vinyl seats look worn, made everything feel slightly more desperate than it might be under normal lighting. Claire held the coffee cup without drinking. Her hands were steady, but her grip was tight, like she was holding on to something. Darius sat across from her with his phone face down on the table, which she noticed, which meant something to her. It meant he wasn't recording her, wasn't using this moment to capture something for social media or news outlets, wasn't turning her into a story while it was happening. "You're not going to ask," she said. "It wasn't a question, it was an observation. I figured you'd tell me what you wanted me to know." She studied him for a moment. The work jacket with the city logo on the sleeve, the city ID clipped to his chest, the particular steadiness of someone who had learned not to show when things surprised him, the kind of calmness that came from dealing with emergencies, from being the person who fixed things when they broke. "I need to be somewhere that isn't on any camera or record for the next few hours," she said. "I'm not in danger. I'm not hurt. I just need time that nobody is tracking. Your phone's been going off since you got in my car." "I know. Someone's going to report you missing." "Someone already has," she said. "That's not the problem I'm trying to solve tonight." Darius looked at her for a long moment. She had the composure of someone who had sat in rooms full of people waiting for her to crack, and had simply outlasted all of them. She had sat in boardrooms with men who tried to intimidate her, who used their voices like weapons, who leaned forward at the table to establish dominance. And she had sat back. She had smiled slightly. She had waited for them to finish. And then she had said the thing that made them all understand she was smarter than they were. But her hands were still cold. He could see it in the way she held the cup, in the slight tremor that appeared when she tried to set it down, in the way her knuckles were white. And beneath the control was something that looked to him less like calm, more like a person holding themselves together through sheer familiarity with the technique, like someone who'd spent 40 years learning to suppress every natural human emotion, who'd learned early on that feelings were a liability in business, that vulnerability was weakness, that the only way to survive was to become impenetrable. He picked up his phone, not to call anyone, just to set it on the table face up so she could see he wasn't recording anything, so she could see that everything they were saying in this diner would stay between them. The news alert was still on the screen. Her face, her name, her company, the announcement of the merger. She glanced at it, then back at him. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since the diner. And you're still here?" "You haven't given me a reason to leave yet," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, without looking at the window, without softening it, "If I sign that contract, Friday morning 200 families lose their homes. Not because the project fails, because it succeeds exactly the way the people behind it planned." Darius didn't answer immediately. He turned his coffee cup once in his hands. A small gesture, something to do while he processed what she had just told him. He had grown up 11 blocks from the Crestwood corridor. He had watched that neighborhood get revitalized when he was 19 years old, had watched the laundromats and corner stores close, had watched the old apartment buildings get bought up by investors, had watched people he knew lose the places they called home. His best friend's family had been forced to move when their building was sold. His grandmother had sold her house below market value to a developer because she was tired of fighting, because she understood what was coming. He knew what rezoning looked like. He knew what it cost. He knew the neighborhoods that would be destroyed. Why doesn't someone just go public? He asked, with what Claire replied. The contract's legally sound. The rezoning is within municipal law. Everything Richard's done has been careful, documented, defensible. Your father's note doesn't matter. Richard would argue it was an early version, that Gerald changed his mind, that the new structure is different, and he'd be technically correct. It is different. The new structure is just more insidious. What about your board? My board is controlled. Richard's been restructuring proxies for 14 months. He has people in key positions. He has leverage on others. It's a chess game that he's been playing for longer than I realized. She pulled up a file on her tablet and turned the screen toward him. This is the Stratton merger structure, she said. What you see publicly is a standard acquisition with a community development clause attached. What you don't see is the rezoning schedule embedded in the municipal approval pipeline. It was filed as a routine infrastructure amendment, 6 pages into a document nobody reads. It's designed to be invisible until it's too late to stop it. Darius leaned forward. He was not a lawyer and had never pretended to be, but he had spent 14 years reading technical documents that other people glossed over. He understood exactly what it meant when the important information was buried in language designed to discourage attention. He'd seen it before in electrical system documentation. The critical safety information hidden in jargon. The emergency procedures buried in dense technical language. The things that could kill you written in a way that made sure nobody paid attention. Your father saw this, he asked. A version of it, early stage, before it was finalized. She paused. He wrote one sentence in the margin and closed the folder. What did it say? She looked at him directly, and something in her face changed. Something vulnerable appeared for just a moment. This is not what we built this for. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The waitress came by to refill their coffee cups. They both declined. Richard has been restructuring board proxies for 14 months, Claire continued. 3 of the 7 independent members now vote with him in practice, regardless of what they say publicly. If I don't sign Friday, he invokes a technical clause in my father's trust. A clause his attorney inserted in the final revision that my father's team missed. It triggers a competency review. It doesn't have to succeed. It just has to create enough delay and noise that Stratton walks. The deal collapses on my watch. And I spend the next year in litigation while Richard positions himself as the stabilizing alternative. So you either sign something your father refused to sign, Darius said, or you get removed for not signing it. That is the shape of it, yes. Darius straightened up. What stops you from going public right now, he asked. You're the CEO. You have access to all of this. Every document I pull gets logged. Every call I make from a company device is on record. My legal team reports to the board, not to me. I found that out 3 months ago. I'm trapped in my own company. That's why I left. She set the tablet down. I needed 48 hours that nobody was watching. I needed to think without someone in my ear telling me what I was thinking. And instead you ended up stuck on the side of a road, Darius said. For the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but close enough to one that it changed her face entirely. The composure cracked slightly. The vulnerability showed through. The storm wasn't in the forecast when I left. Darius poured the coffee. Outside, the wind pressed against the window glass with a low, sustained sound, a sound like the building itself was breathing, like the structure was struggling against the weight of the storm. He thought about Nora. He thought about what it meant to be away from her all night. What it meant to be sitting in a diner with a billionaire talking about mergers and rezoning while his daughter slept in a bed he'd left her in. He thought about the responsibility of that, the weight of it. He picked up his phone and called home. She answered on the second ring. Still half asleep, indignant. "Dad, it's 4 o'clock in the morning." "I know, baby. I've got an unexpected situation with work. You're going to stay with Mrs. Patterson tomorrow until I call. Don't argue." A pause. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, I promise. Go back to sleep. You always say everything's fine, because it usually is. Good night, Nora." He hung up and looked at Claire, who was not pretending she hadn't heard the call. "You have a kid," she said. 7, almost 8. Her name's Nora." She nodded slowly, in the way of someone recalibrating something internal that she didn't put into words. Someone understanding that there was a child depending on this man, a child who needed him, a child who would lose him if anything went wrong, and that understanding changed something in how she looked at him. They worked through what remained of the night and into the pale grey-edged morning. Nora had a teachers' conference that afternoon. She needed her father to be there. Claire had fragments, financial records, internal memos she had photographed on her personal phone, a timeline she had reconstructed from memory and cross-reference against public filings. She had enough to tell the story, but not enough to prove it in a way that would survive legal scrutiny. What she was missing was corroboration from outside the company structure. Something that touched the project from a different angle. Something that couldn't be attributed to a CEO protecting her own position. Darius was scrolling through the project appendix on her tablet. The infrastructure component, because that was where his eye naturally went. The electrical systems that would power the new commercial development. The systems that, if they failed, would reveal that the infrastructure hadn't been properly planned, that the rezoning had been done without proper engineering. When he stopped, he read the entry twice. Then he set the tablet on the table very carefully. The way he set things down when he was managing a reaction he hadn't decided how to present yet. "This subcontractor," he said. "Vantage Electrical Systems. They're listed as the primary low-voltage contractor for the Stratton development sites." "That's correct. 8 months ago, I filed an incident report on a Vantage crew working a municipal retrofit in the Crestwood sector. 3 safety violations in one site, load calculations that didn't match the permits. I documented everything. Dates, crew IDs, the specific code sections they were out of compliance with. I took photographs. I filed everything properly." Claire was very still. "The report went into the system and I never heard back," he continued. "I followed up twice. Nothing. I assumed it was the usual backlog, the way these things move slow." "It wasn't backlog," Claire said quietly. "I've seen that report, Darius." He looked up. 2 weeks ago," she said. "Richard was reviewing the infrastructure approval files, and he had a stack of documents on the conference room table. I walked in early. Before the meeting started, the report was on top. Your name, your ID number, your signature." He closed the folder before I could read past the header. She paused. "I didn't know what it was at the time. I didn't know your name." The kitchen was very quiet. The fluorescent light hummed slightly. Someone dropped a plate in the back. The sound of the diner continuing around them while they sat in this moment. "So my report didn't get lost," he said. "No, it got buried because it would have flagged Vantage. And if Vantage gets flagged, the infrastructure approval for the Stratton sites falls apart. And if that falls apart, the entire legal foundation of the merger becomes contestable," Claire finished. "Yes, it's the leverage they needed. It's the proof." Darius leaned back in his chair. He was working through it the way he worked through electrical faults, tracing the current backward from the failure point to the source, finding where the problem originated, following the path it took through the system, understanding how it all connected. The shape of it was becoming clear, and the shape was not complicated. It was just large. It involved his report being suppressed. It involved infrastructure being designed with safety violations. It involved families being displaced. It involved a merger being structured to destroy neighborhoods. And it involved a woman sitting across from him who discovered this and decided she couldn't be part of it. Then he asked the question he needed to ask. "Did you know it was me before tonight?" Claire held his gaze. She did not look away. She did not answer immediately. And the length of that pause told him something before her words did. "I knew a name on a report that had been suppressed," she said. "I didn't know your face. I didn't know you worked the Crestwood corridor or that you drove that road after your shift. I didn't know about Nora. A beat. But when I realized who you were, I won't pretend I didn't understand what that meant for what I was trying to do. It was honest." He gave her credit for that. "It was also not nothing. So I'm useful to you," he said, not an accusation, a fact being placed on the table between them. "You were," she said. She looked down at her coffee cup, then back at him. "I'm not sure that's still the whole of it." He didn't respond to that. Not yet, because something else was happening. Something he didn't have words for. She was looking at him like she was seeing him. Really seeing him, not seeing the electrician or the single father or the person who could help her with her problem, but seeing the man underneath all of that. The person who'd made the choice to stop his car on a snowy night. The person who'd gotten on a plane without thinking about consequences. The person who'd chosen to help even when helping could cost him everything. By Thursday afternoon, the situation outside had moved faster than either of them had anticipated. Claire's absence had been framed carefully and quickly as erratic behavior. A source inside Harmon Capital had told two financial journalists that the CEO had become emotionally volatile in the lead-up to the signing. That there were concerns about her fitness to execute the deal, that perhaps she was having a breakdown. The story wasn't printed yet, but it was circulating in the way that stories did when someone wanted them to circulate before they were officially confirmed. It was the kind of story that would soften people's judgment of Richard. That would make her seem unreliable, unstable. Richard had called an emergency board session for Friday morning, 2 hours before the scheduled signing. He was going to propose that she step down. He was going to suggest that her mental health was in question. He was going to position himself as the adult in the room, the person who could be trusted to make the right decision. Darius found out about the board session from a news alert. He showed Claire. She read it twice and said nothing, which was he had come to understand what she did when she was making a decision she hadn't finished making, when she was calculating her options, weighing her choices, trying to figure out what was possible and what was not. Then his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered out of habit. The voice on the other end was calm and male and did not introduce itself. "Mr. Webb, you're somewhere you don't belong." The voice was quiet, almost conversational, but there was something underneath it. Something dangerous. I'd think carefully about where your loyalties are and what you have to lose. The connection cut off. Darius looked at Claire. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't even particularly frightened. "Richard," she said simply. "How did he pays people to know things. People in city government, people in corporate security, people who watch for information like yours leaking out. He knows you're here. He knows what you have. He knows what you're planning to do. And he's reminding you that you have something to lose." She stood up. "We need to move now, before this gets worse, before he finds a way to discredit you, before he figures out how to use what you know against you instead of against him." What happened in the next 12 hours became the thing that changed everything. Claire went to a journalist she trusted, A woman named Sarah who'd been covering municipal corruption for 15 years. Sarah who'd built a reputation for telling the truth even when the truth was complicated, even when it cost her sources, even when it put her at odds with powerful people. Sarah listened to the entire story. Claire didn't hold anything back. She showed her the documents. She explained the merger structure. She described the rezoning strategy designed to displace 200 families. She talked about her father's refusal. She talked about Richard's manipulation. She talked about the report that had been suppressed. And she talked about Darius, about the man who'd stopped his car on a snowy night, about the electrician whose report could prove that the merger was built on corruption. Sarah looked at the documents. She looked at Claire. And she said the words Claire had been terrified and hoping to hear. This is publishable. This is real. And this needs to be in the world before Friday morning. They worked through the night. Sarah contacted her editors. She reached out to her sources in city government. She verified every claim. She double-checked every fact. She built the story carefully, methodically, in a way that left no room for argument. By 6 a.m. Friday, the story broke. CEO uncovers widespread corruption in merger deal board attempted cover-up. The headline was everywhere. The details were stark. Richard's manipulation of proxies. The buried report about safety violations. The rezoning strategy designed to displace 200 families. The attempted intimidation of a witness. By 7:30 a.m., Richard had been placed on administrative leave. He wasn't even fired yet. Just removed from immediate authority. His access to the company's systems had been cut off. His office had been sealed. His reputation was being discussed on every news outlet in the country. By 8 a.m., the board had called an emergency meeting to discuss the company's future, without Richard, without Claire, to figure out what came next. By 8:45 a.m., Stratton Group had issued a statement withdrawing from the merger. Recent information has come to light that renders the acquisition no longer viable from a due diligence perspective, meaning we can't be associated with this corruption, meaning the deal is dead, meaning 200 families weren't going to be displaced. Not by this merger anyway. By 9 a.m., Darius received a call from his supervisor at the city. Not a threat, an apology. We found your report. We're investigating how it got suppressed. We're implementing new protocols. I'm sorry for the failure of the system. By 9:15 a.m., Claire walked into the emergency board meeting and resigned. I will be transferring my controlling interest to an employee-owned trust structure, she said, and I will be cooperating fully with any investigations into the company's conduct. The board tried to convince her to stay. She refused. She understood that she could no longer be the CEO of a company that had allowed this corruption, that she needed to step away, that the only way to move forward was to acknowledge that she'd failed, that her company had failed, that the systems had failed, and that she needed to be accountable for that failure. By 10 a.m., Claire and Darius were sitting in a car in a parking garage, and they were both shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of what they'd just done. From the knowledge that they'd chosen integrity over everything else, from the understanding that the world would punish them for it, but that they'd survived. A week later, the lawsuits began. Richard sued for defamation. He claimed that the story was false, that he'd been unfairly portrayed, that his reputation had been damaged. Harmon Capital's board sued Claire for breach of fiduciary duty. They claimed that she'd acted recklessly, that she'd damaged the company's reputation, that she owed them compensation. Stratton Group sued for damages related to the failed merger. They claimed that they'd lost $200 million in opportunity costs, that they deserved payment for their losses. The legal bills began to pile up immediately. Tommy Darius' union rep called him. "They're offering you a settlement," Tommy said. $280,000. It's significant money. It's enough to change your life. It's enough to pay off your debts, take care of Nora for a few years, and give you breathing room to figure out what comes next. Darius thought about Nora. He thought about what it meant to have proven that he could do the right thing even when it cost him everything. He thought about what it meant to have a daughter who would grow up knowing her father had chosen integrity. Who would hear the story of this moment and understand that some things were worth more than money? That some choices were important for reasons that had nothing to do with personal gain. Take it, he said. For Claire, the situation was more complicated. She faced potential bankruptcy. Litigation costs alone would exceed $500,000. She would lose her company, her position, most of her wealth. She would be left with maybe $100 million in assets after everything was paid, which was still billions of dollars more than most people had. But it was a loss, a significant loss, a loss that meant she could never go back to being the person she'd been. And she would do it anyway, because the alternative was living with a choice she couldn't unmake. Because living with the knowledge that she'd destroyed 200 families for profit was worse than losing money. Darius and Claire stood at a crossroads in the parking garage of a building they were about to leave behind. They didn't talk about the future. They didn't make promises. They didn't say, "I love you," or "let's figure this out," or any of the things that people usually say in moments like this. They just stood there, in the cool darkness of a parking garage. Two people who'd made impossible choices. Two people who'd chosen integrity when it would have been so much easier to choose comfort. And something shifted between them. Something that didn't have words. Something that existed in the space between one person and another. When they understood that they weren't alone anymore. 3 months later, Darius applied to the advanced electrical engineering program he'd turned down years before. The program had given up so that Nora could have stability. This time he had a reason to believe it might be possible. This time he had support. This time there was someone to pick up Nora from school. Someone who'd chosen to be there. Who'd chosen to help. Who'd chosen him. The application was accepted within 2 weeks. He would start in the fall. It would take 3 years. It would be brutally hard. But it meant that he wasn't just maintaining systems anymore. He would be designing them. He would be building the infrastructure that other people depended on. He would be creating something that lasted, that mattered, that changed things. 3 months later, Claire had filed for bankruptcy protection. She transferred her remaining liquid assets to a fund designed to support families displaced by commercial development. She'd hired lawyers to help negotiate with the families who would have been displaced by the merger, to find ways to keep them in their homes, to protect their communities from future development schemes. She'd taken a consulting job with a non-profit focused on community protection for $75,000 a year, which was less than most people made in a year, which was a tenth of what she used to make in a month, but which felt in some fundamental way like real work, like work that mattered, like work that was building something instead of destroying it. And she'd started the quiet, slow work of becoming someone different than she'd been. Someone who understood that power was a responsibility. That wealth was an accident of birth, not a measure of worth. That integrity cost something, but the cost of abandoning it was higher. The media frenzy lasted 6 weeks. News outlets covered every angle of the story. The corruption scandal, the brave electrician, the principled CEO, the families that were saved. Then the world moved on to the next story. By the time the lawsuit settled, Richard losing his case and facing criminal charges for securities fraud, Harmon Capital paying a settlement to families affected by the merger attempt, Stratton Group declining further action, nobody was paying attention anymore. Darius Mitchell was no longer a hero in the news cycle. He was just a man who worked days now, studied in the evenings, and came home to a daughter who needed him, who came home to the apartment he shared with Claire, who was building something slow and quiet and real. Claire Harmon was no longer a CEO in crisis. She was just a woman rebuilding her life from the ruins of her own choices, who'd learned to live on less money, who'd learned that significance wasn't measured in quarterly earnings, who'd learned that meaning came from the people you helped, not the profits you made. And sometimes on quiet evenings, they would sit together and not talk about what they'd done, because what they'd done didn't need to be talked about. It just needed to be lived with. It just needed to shape every decision they made going forward. It just needed to be the foundation of their new lives. 1 year later, Nora was 8 years old and asking questions about why Claire spent so much time at their apartment, about why she'd started keeping clothes in their guest room, about why she and her father smiled at each other in a way that was different from how her father smiled at anyone else. "She's my friend," Darius told her. "Is she your girlfriend?" Nora asked with the directness of a child. "Maybe," Darius said. "We're figuring it out. Are you going to get married?" "I don't know, Nora. We just know that we care about each other and we want to keep trying." Nora accepted this with the seriousness of a child who'd learned that adults didn't always have answers, who'd learned that uncertainty was okay, that you could care about someone without knowing what the future held, that love wasn't about guarantees. It was about choosing to show up again and again, even when things got hard. "Okay," she said, "but if she leaves, I'm going to be sad." "I know," Darius said. "She knows that too. That's why she's trying so hard not to leave." Claire was sitting in the kitchen when Nora came in asking for a snack. She made Nora's favorite toast with butter and honey cut into triangles the way Nora liked them, cut at exactly the right angle, placed on the plate at exactly the right distance from the edge. The kind of attention to detail that came from understanding that for some people, small things mattered enormously. That if you wanted to help someone, you paid attention to the things they needed, even if those things seemed small to you. And Nora, who'd been skeptical of this woman at first, sat down and ate the toast without complaint, which for a child with specific sensory preferences was everything, which was a sign that something was shifting. That trust was being built, one small gesture at a time. 2 years after the night on the side of the road, Darius graduated from the electrical engineering program. He'd passed every exam. He'd impressed every instructor. He'd earned a reputation as someone who understood not just the technical aspects of electrical systems, but the human cost of failure. Who understood that infrastructure wasn't just about the numbers and the calculations. It was about the people who depended on those systems working. It was about the families who would suffer if things failed. It was about responsibility. The same week he was offered a job as a training coordinator for the city's Department of Electrical Infrastructure. It was a position that would allow him to teach other electricians, to pass on knowledge, to make sure that the next generation of people doing invisible work understood that their work mattered, that they were building something, that they were creating infrastructure that would last for decades, that they were part of something bigger than themselves. He accepted it immediately. For the first time in his life, he would have benefits, real health care, retirement savings, paid time off, things that most people took for granted, things that had always felt out of reach for someone like him. Claire had started her nonprofit the same week, Community Bridge, an organization focused on protecting residents in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods from development-related displacement. She worked 80-hour weeks. She made a tenth of what she used to make as a CEO. And she slept better than she'd slept in 20 years. She was using her business knowledge to help neighborhoods fight development schemes. She was teaching communities how to understand zoning laws, how to organize resistance, how to protect themselves from being erased. She was doing what her father had done, but for people who didn't have money to hire fancy lawyers. She was leveling the playing field, one neighborhood at a time. Richard Harmon faced criminal charges for securities fraud. He was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. His career in business was over. His reputation was destroyed. His family had distanced themselves from him. And he never once understood that the destruction was deserved. He still believed even in prison that he'd been treated unfairly, that he'd been the victim of a corporate coup, that Claire had conspired against him out of jealousy. He never understood that integrity had a price, that when you violated it, the world had the right to hold you accountable, that consequences weren't punishment. They were just the natural result of the choices you made. 3 years after that night, Darius and Claire bought a house together. It was modest, a 3-bedroom in a neighborhood that was slowly being revitalized, but not through displacement, through actual community investment, through the kind of development that honored the people who already lived there. They'd saved for years. They'd made sacrifices, but they'd done it together. And the house was theirs. Nora helped pick out her room. She chose the bedroom that had the biggest window, because she said she liked being able to see outside, to know what was coming, to not be surprised, to have control over her environment. And they understood that this was her way of saying she felt safe, that she trusted that the people in this house would take care of her, that the foundation was solid. On the night they moved in, Darius and Claire sat on the porch steps and didn't talk about the night that had started everything, because that night was no longer the thing that defined them. They were defined now by the 1,000 small choices they'd made since, by the commitment to keep choosing each other, by the knowledge that integrity costs something, but the cost of abandoning it is higher. Nora was asleep inside. Tomorrow she would go to school. She would learn science. She would come home excited about what she'd discovered. She would show them her homework. She would argue about dinner. She would be the particular, challenging, wonderful child she'd always been, and they would be here for it, both of them, showing up again and again, even when things got hard. The city kept changing. New buildings went up. Neighborhoods were transformed. But here and there in spaces that had been marked for destruction, there was a presence that wasn't there before. A woman with a non-profit, an electrician teaching the next generation, a child who grew up knowing that her father had done something brave and survived, a community that was protected because people chose to protect it. And the world kept turning without fully understanding what had happened, without knowing the names of the people who changed it, without recognizing the cost that had been paid, which was fine, because they never needed the world to know. They just needed to know that they'd done the right thing, and that the right thing was survivable, and that sometimes when you choose integrity, you find more than you lost. Sometimes you find a person who chose integrity too, and together you build something real, something that lasts, something that matters. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that grace is possible, that second chances exist, that the quiet courage it takes to love well is worth the cost. Subscribe our channel for more stories like this one. Stories about people who choose what's right, even when it costs them everything. Because those are the stories that matter. Those are the stories that change the world, one honest choice at a time.